Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle. The show that you all know brings you the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy, which we've done for some 34 years now here at FFF. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, who was with FFF when we got founded 34 years ago as academic vice president of the foundation. Richard, good to see you again. Welcome back.
Good to be back with you, our viewers, and our listeners.
Okay, Richard, we had a big tragedy happen in Hawaii, as you know, as everyone knows. This wildfire takes place and just wipes out this town of Lahaina there on the island of Maui. And I don't know how many people have died. I don't know sure if they know, but it's got to number in the hundreds. And it really raises two questions here. And one of them is, what is the role of government to prevent these types of things? Because that appears to be a major disaster here. And the role of government to handle things during the crisis and then in the after crisis. And, we've become so accustomed to government playing a role in this thing that it's virtually impossible for people to imagine what life would be like if government did not do it, which is what I advocate. I think people, well, there's no doubt in my mind that people would be better off if government stayed out of these things entirely. And let me give you just a little summation of my arguments here, because we're dealing not just with this tragedy of this wildfire where so many people burned alive and their pets and had their homes destroyed and their property destroyed. We're also dealing with this kind of situation in other crises involving natural disasters like hurricanes and tornadoes and things like this. And if you look at this particular situation, it's clear that there was a massive failure of government to warn people. The sirens didn't go off to warn people something was happening. And the explanation was, well, the sirens are supposed to be for tsunamis, and we were afraid people might run into the mountains, which to me is just absolutely ludicrous. I mean, people would be able to see that the fire is coming down the mountains. And when you've got a chance of survival, even if people might make a mistake, you at least might save some people that get out of their houses and realize that something's going on here. And then I also read an account where the police blocked a certain highway where there was this long line of cars of people trying to get out of there, and the police were blocking it. But I think the biggest thing here, Richard, is that people are so accustomed to relying on government to warn them of things that there's this misguided reliance that in the absence of this, people would say, okay, government's not here taking care of us. We need to figure out a plan in case there's an emergency. But when you have a mindset of, I don't need to worry, the government's taking care of me. If there's an emergency, they'll let me know. I can just rely on them. Then you get this kind of tragedy where people are just waiting for the government to do something, and the government's abrogating its responsibility. And then there's the question of what should government do in the aftermath of a tragedy like this? And from what I read, that was a disaster too. And I read an article where you had all these private individuals coming to relieve people there, to help people. They were coming in their boats and stuff. And this is what really charity is all about. And this is what I've always said. You can rely on this kind of instinct, not among everybody, but within a large number of people. The instinct is, let me go help. I want to go help. And to me, that is really the only charity that's worth anything. And the idea that government should do this, a lot of times government gets in the way. Like, for example, in many of these emergencies, they enact the anti-gouging laws, where they say, oh, we're protecting the people here. You can't charge over a certain amount. Well, it turns into a disaster, because like if people need ice or water, you want entrepreneurs coming in, flooding into this market, risking their lives in order to make a lot of money here, because then that furnishes the water. But when you put a price cap on there, the entrepreneur says, why should I risk my life to get water in there? And so you end up having government actually make the disaster worse. So what I'm suggesting here is that everyone would be better off just separating emergencies in the state and let the free market work, let private individuals work, not only to prepare for potential disasters, but also to handle the aftermath of disasters. What do you think, Richard?
Well, Americans in the 19th century, certainly in the early and middle parts of the 19th century, before government began a more intrusive role in the last decades of the 19th century, uh, basically relied upon what is known as civil society, those voluntary associations and organizations that people form in communities and wider areas, sometimes nationally associations, for mutual help and assistance to take care of circumstances that they think are important to deal with, but are beyond one person's capacity. Uh, as I've mentioned before, if you read Alexis de Tocqueville's famous book, Democracy in America, based upon I guess it was about a year and a half or 2 year stay he had in the United States in the mid 1830s, he makes a point in volume 2 of bringing to his European readers attention to the fact that wherever he went, there were these voluntary associations for fire, for mutual assistance, for charity work, for private education, all of these things. And if that seems like, well, that's then, and what about today? I would just ask some of the viewers and listeners to remember that terrible hurricane that went through New Orleans, Katrina, several years ago, and the disaster that had with government assistance, whereas there were people not just from Louisiana and other surrounding states, but many other parts of the country who attempted to and wanted to come to provide voluntary assistance and support, from everything to try to get people off houses that were surrounded by rising water, to food, blankets, forms of mobile shelter. And FEMA and the other authorities would just prevent this, or slowed it down, or said they weren't authorized, they weren't professionals. So in the name of assuring professionals doing it, you lock out what they would consider, quote, the untrained amateurs, who in fact, by locking them out, prevented many people from having the assistance and support that would have made their life perhaps saved, or certainly made easier in the immediate aftermath of this terrible catastrophe. Hayek, the famous Austrian economist Hayek, always emphasized the decentralization of knowledge, and that knowledge is dispersed in different ways in all of our localized areas in which we live, we work, we interact, we associate. And that means that people on the spot know things and appreciate the changing currents of the circumstance, which can be daily or even hourly, better than people sitting in a state capitol or the Washington, D.C., with some heavy-handed follow the rule book bureaucracy, and then waiting and depending for them to do this. And that certainly is the case, is what happened in the case of Maui. It is one thing to say that a disaster occurs, and you could say, do the authorities have any responsibility? That is, policing against looting, probably. But in terms of assistance, support, recovery, giving people post-disaster shelter and help, that should all be the private sector. Let me give an example. A few years ago, we had a serious hurricane threat here in the Charleston area. It ended up being like a Cat 2 or something. But my wife and I decided to board up the house, and we went up from Charleston to Charlotte, North Carolina, about 3.5 hours inland. And so we checked into the hotel we're at. And I'm not going to mention the name of the insurance company that we do our house and car insurance with. But we suddenly noticed that in this parking lot of this hotel was this huge fleet of emergency trucks of this insurance company. And when we got back, I said, we noticed this all in this. There were like dozens upon dozens of these emergency vehicles from our insurance company. I was talking to my insurance dealer, and he said, yes, as a precaution and to be prepared, we had all of those vehicles ready, that if disaster struck in the Charleston area, all of those vehicles would be down to give people support, help, to find out what their coverage permitted, to be immediately allocated to help them get by financially. Well, that's the private sector. That's free enterprise. Oh, dare I say, the evil self-interested profit motive. My gosh. If I can give one other example of this, the private sector handling things better. When 9/11 occurred, my wife and I were at a Mont Pelerin Society meeting in Bratislava, Slovakia. And we went from there to Prague because I was supposed to give some lectures. And the airlines company, the government had frozen all the flights out of Europe. And now you're stuck there for days and days and days. So we had a rental car. And again, I won't name the car rental company, but I went to their Prague office and I said, well, I'm supposed to return the car in Vienna, where we picked up the car having landed there. Oh no, our home office just sent us a telex. Remember, it's 2001 telex messages. We just got a telex from the home office in the United States that because of this emergency, anyone who has rented one of our vehicles before 9/11 occurred and now is stranded in Europe for some period of time has their rental on the car continued at no cost as a support and a concern for our customers. So we were stuck in Prague for almost an additional week before we finally flew back to the United States at no expense. Now, you could ask the question, why did they do this? What was it? They were good-hearted. They loved their fellow man. No, that might have been part of it. Let's give the benefit of the doubt. It might have been part of it. But I'm sure that the executives in the headquarters of this car rental company in New York said, you know something, besides the fact that this is a hardship, these people are going to come back and they're going to say, well, you got stranded. What happened while you were stranded? Could you get a hotel room? How did you get around? Well, my rental company gave us the car for free until I could fly back. How do you pay for that positive advertising? That's a company that in emergency you can rely upon at no cost to yourself. Now, I know that's just one example. It sounds anecdotal, but that's how the market responds to these situations. Besides empathy and sympathy, you link that with degrees of market-based self-interest, and wonders occur. Wonders occur. And so I believe that if we just left this to the free marketplace to sort this out, the private sector, voluntary associations, charitable organizations, both on the spot and further away, would be adaptable and flexible and more immediate in their responses. They're relying upon the plodding and slow-moving bureaucracy. These are the rules. This is when we do it. Oh, it hasn't happened. Oh, the siren is for a tsunami. This is a fire. Not today. Now, I know my voice is being sarcastic, but I mean, this is the mindset of these people. You don't see that in most dynamic charity-based organizations.
Yeah, that's an excellent analysis. And I'm glad you started out with de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, because when I first read that book, I was flabbergasted. I mean, it had a big impact on me because, you know, he comes to America just to see how things are going. A remarkable experiment where the government doesn't have this power to help people out. Mm-hmm. And this is a very unusual system compared to the systems in Europe, where the whole role of the government is to protect the people, protect the poor, help them out, a massive, essentially a welfare state type of life. And so, and he sees all these immigrants flooding into America, where they're coming to a land where government's not going to help you out. It's that old saying, root hog or die. You have to make your own way here. And nobody's going to be here to bail you out. And so you're all of a sudden, all these immigrants are fleeing the land of paternalism to come to America. And de Tocqueville's kind of mystified by this. The whole world was mystified by it. So he's, I'm going to come and check this out. Well, he determines in this land where there's no welfare state, no warfare state, no income tax. People are free to keep everything they earn, no economic regulations to speak of. And he realizes that when people are free to accumulate wealth, all of a sudden there's a certain segment of society that are using that wealth to help out others, that are donating it. Now we're talking about multimillionaires like John D. Rockefeller and so forth, and that this is how the museums are getting built, not because of an income tax deduction, because there's no income tax. just because people want to do good things with the money that they're now accumulating, really for the first time in history. Because when all you've got is subsistence level wages, you can't help anybody out. The only way that charity can start coming to the forefront is if people have enough money to not only sustain themselves, but to provide for their savings for later on in life, contingency, retirement, but then an extra amount that says, I want to help out others. I want to help build that church there. I want to help build that opera house. So de Tocqueville comes in and says, oh my gosh, there are more voluntary organizations here that you can ever imagine. I mean, they're everywhere. They're helping out here, and they're helping out here, and they're helping out here. One almost gets the impression that there's so much voluntary charity that there must have been people saying there's too much voluntary charity in this country. But that's the way people operate. They showed the way that this is what happens when people are free. And you can trust freedom, but you got to have faith in freedom. And the problem we face today in this country is that everybody puts their faith in the state because we're so accustomed to the state taking care of people, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education grants, FEMA, and all these other apparatuses where you can look to the state to take care of you. And then the mindset develops when you're born and raised under this system that, oh my gosh, if you dismantle this system, everybody'd be dying in the streets. Or if you didn't have public schooling and you got rid of it immediately, everybody would go stupid because nobody get educated because nobody cares about education for their children. So you have to have the state force them to subject their children to this. So when you grow up in this system, it's very difficult to capture this faith that de Tocqueville witnessed in America in a system where the state's not taking care of people. But it's that faith that we need to recapture in this country, and we catch glimpses of it. I mean, there's wealthy people that do donate to help out children get an education, scholarships. There's charitable organizations that have scholarship drives, food drives, and so forth. And then we see it here in Lahaina and Maui, where you have all these private individuals that immediately start responding, saying, I want to help. And I think that if we can just recapture that faith and freedom and in the ability of people, the willingness of people to honor mother and father on a voluntary basis, a free market healthcare system where we have faith that doctors will provide for the poor on a purely voluntary basis, simply because they're making so much money off the people that can pay. Let me give you a personal example of this phenomenon. Many years ago, my dentist in Virginia told me that they had one day, he and other dentists got together. Now, remember, there's no Medicare for dentistry. You got to pay your own dentist bill. And so the poor, obviously, they have to pay their dentist bill. So what my dentist did, he got together with, I don't know, several other dentists, and they had one day devoted to the poor. And they would do it on a rotating basis, where each dentist would do it on the Thursday of that week. And then the poor came in and got free dental services simply because they believed it was the right thing to do. And in my hometown of Laredo, when I was growing up, there was no Medicare, no Medicaid, and every doctor's office, we were among the poorest city in the United States. We were told that we were the actual poorest city in the United States per capita income. The doctor's offices were filled, Richard, every day with people who could not pay. And the doctors never turned away anyone. They handle them knowing that they'd send out a bill, but they know that they'd never get paid. And sometimes people would bring in chickens or tamales or something to pay the doctor that way. But the doctors didn't care. They felt it was their moral duty to do this. And this is what we need to recapture, is this faith that you can trust freedom, and that trusting the state is actually going to be much more harmful to you than if you just eliminated the state. And your point is very, very good about what is the role of government in an emergency like this. It's the traditional role of the police. Target the people that are initiating force, the murderers, the rapists, the looters, the plunderers. If the state focuses only in on that, that keeps people safe while the private sector is doing all this voluntary activity. Let me give one final example from a personal standpoint. We had a house in Port Aransas, Texas, growing up, and one time a hurricane hit there. And so my dad said, let's go check it out, see what happened to our house. And he loaded up the car with these huge ice chests filled with ice, just packed. and he gets up to the causeway where leading to Port Aransas, and there's a police blockade there. And we stopped there. They said, "Nope, we can't let you go on there." And my dad says, "I own a house there. I'm just going to check out the house." "Nope, can't do it." So they have this blockade, like, for what purpose? I mean, it's ridiculous. Well, my dad says to him, "Look, I've got these huge ice chests filled with ice. All I want to do is check out my house. I give you my word, I will leave the ice there for people on the island." To the cop, to his everlasting credit, says, "Go ahead." And so we got there, we checked the house. My dad left the ice there for people on the island. And, this is what life's supposed to be all about: private ownership, private people taking care of things, voluntary charity. Let the free market operate. No anti-gouging laws. Let entrepreneurs come in, selling things at whatever price the market provides, because that's what resolves the crisis, not the state.
Yeah. Let me mention a few more examples. Talking about that 9/11 episode and the car rental jolted my memory about one other episode at that time. So we're in Prague, and we had made reservations at a well-known hotel chain before, and this was obviously made the reservations before 9/11 occurred. And so we arrive in Prague, and we say, we've just talked to the airline. We're going to be here longer than that. Can we extend our stay? And there were concerns because other people had reservations for our room after we were supposed to check out if this emergency hadn't occurred. And a lot of Americans were in this situation. So some of the Americans, where am I going to stay? I'll be out on the street. I don't know when I'm going home. Called the U.S. Embassy in Prague. And said, can the consular service help? Maybe talk to the hotel owners or the managers or something. That is not the duty of the U.S. government. We deal with national security issues. Now, I'm not saying that they should have, but many people would expect, oh, you're in an emergency. By golly, you're an American. You call upon the consular, to give you a little assistance or advice. It's not our purview. I mean, but that's because, they're concerned with, nuclear attacks. Okay. So what did these people do? They went back to a couple of the hotels where their reservations were going to be ending soon. And then what happened is the hotel managers of several, particularly the US-owned hotels in Prague, just got together and just brainstormed to figure out, well, how do we take care of the people who, beyond their control, are now stuck here for a few more days, but the people who have reservations for those same rooms who made them before the crisis occurred. And they just a way to handle it, moving people from one hotel to another, or figure out different rooms in the hotel. But they took care of it themselves. And one other example about doctors, if I can say, I would assume that some of the viewers and listeners may have heard the name of the famous 19th century Russian novelist Anton Chekhov, famous for a novel of fathers and sons. But he made his living as a doctor. And for a good part of the time, he was a rural doctor in Imperial Russia, like the last part of the 19th century. And so he's dealing with these peasants out in rural Russia. And, you get sick, the kid has an injury, all the usual stuff. But these are poor peasants. So they would come and they'd pay him with a chicken or a duck, or, free milk from, milking their cow, because they couldn't afford money. And he just assumed that was it. And of course, a person really didn't have the money to do that, he just did it gratis, because you were just expected to do that. But there's this image, heartless capitalist medicine. Oh, unless the government guarantees these minimum services at taxpayers' expense and mandates this and mandates that, people will be dying in the streets, suffering from illnesses untreated. And that is just nonsense. The fact is, government has not been involved in medical care in some big or small way only since the 1930s and 40s. And the fact is, before that, it was all the private sector. And all of the charitable hospitals, the research centers, all of this was done through private money, often church-based charitable hospitals, but often secular ones, or someone benevolently just left a bequest, to build a hospital and a certain amount of money to help fund it year after year out of an annuity. This is how these things were done. And unfortunately, the history of this has gone down an Orwellian memory hole, that people have no idea that there were creative and flexible and adaptive and voluntary ways to solve what are considered the social problems, but without the state, without the state. And that is what we need to get first, a re-understanding of the history of this, and a realization of why it is superior to this, and why, from a philosophical point of view, it should not be the legitimate function of government.
Yeah, your point about hospitals is hit home with me, because I mentioned the doctors in Laredo that were providing free medical care to the poor, and the doctors were still the second wealthiest group in town. The wealthiest group were the oil people, but the doctors were a close second, and they just felt it was their moral obligation to give back to the community. So they wouldn't ask questions. They just treat everybody. And a lot of the poor were from Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. We lived on the border. And they didn't ask for people's citizenship. They say, oh, I'm not going to treat you because you're not an American citizen. This is the way they operated. And the hospital, we only had one hospital in town called Mercy Hospital, and it was a Catholic hospital. And they charged, but they were a charitable hospital. People they couldn't pay, they didn't turn them away. And then many years later, a for-profit hospital formed in town, which is great. You have a mixture of a for-profit operation, a charitable operation. But what's important to keep in mind is that the more money people are able to accumulate, like with no income taxation, the more they can give away. The less they have to keep, the less they can give away. So if you want more of this, you've got to stop government from taking so much from people. For the obvious reason, not only because it hurts them sustain their own lives and their own retirements and so forth, but it precludes them from donating more for these charitable hospitals and other voluntary activity. So, Richard, we're out of time. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we just need to understand the power of freedom. Freedom is just not a matter of saying me and mine and leave me alone. Freedom is also a way for people to ask themselves, what are my responsibilities to myself, to my family, to my friends, to the community I live in, and in the benevolent sense of just being a human being, to others who sometimes have crises and disasters in other parts of the nation, the continent, or the world. And if you have a calling, or you have and the financial means or the in-kind time to do that, I think that relying upon those things are far superior than the heavy-handed and rigid rule following of the bureaucratic state.
Yeah, and I'll add to that by saying, a lot of people say, oh, well, not everyone would help the poor and the needy. And I say, okay, that's part of what freedom's all about. If you're forced to take care for others, you're not free. And it's through this exercise of choice where people say, oh, well, should I donate to this cause? Should I not donate to this cause? That's how conscience is exercised, through having this wide ambit of choice. And then by exercising conscience, that's where the level of consciousness and right conduct starts to rise in a society. But it has to come through freedom of choice, not through the violence of mandates of the state. On that note, Richard, let's wrap things up. We're out of time. I'm Jacob Hornberger. Come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we have strived to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet on a daily basis for, probably around 20 years or more. And we come to our website. We've got all the multimedia, all our conferences, and our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. And Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to talking to you next time.
Until next time.